Charles Blackwood's calculated vengeance began with what seemed like a minor incident, a misunderstanding on a flight that led to him being kicked off by a flight attendant. Yet, what was a slight moment of disrespect turned into a chain of events that would send shockwaves through the business world. After being asked to leave the plane by Jenna, the flight attendant, Charles calmly exited the aircraft. But this wasn't the end for him. As he stood in the terminal, he made a phone call to his lawyer, Gregory. Instead of brushing off the incident, Charles devised a plan. He decided to make the airline pay in a way no one could predict, by owning it. With Gregory's help, Charles initiated a hostile takeover of the airline. Using his wealth and influence, Charles moved quickly, buying up stock in the company and negotiating with major investors to gain control. The situation escalated fast, and within hours, the airline executives were scrambling to deal with the surprise bid. Please subscribe my channel and support me by hitting like button. The CEO, David Clarkson, was left in disbelief as Charles's power and resources made it clear that he wasn't just a billionaire businessman, he was someone who could reshape the entire airline industry with a single phone call. When the deal was finalized, Charles not only owned the airline, but made sure that the entire world knew about it. The media caught wind of the story, and headlines ran with it. A billionaire had taken control of the airline after a public confrontation. Charles made his statement clear by walking into the boardroom of the airline's corporate headquarters, where the remaining executives sat in shock. As he stood before them, his message was simple and powerful. He was in charge now. In the end, the flight attendant who had once underestimated him would never forget the consequences of her actions. Charles's takeover wasn't just about acquiring a company. It was about showing the world that disrespect, no matter how small, could lead to unimaginable power. Charles Blackwood stepped into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom with a sense of quiet authority. The air in the room shifted as the executives, visibly rattled, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Clarkson, the CEO, tried to maintain his composure, rising from his seat to offer a stiff handshake. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice tight, "we didn't expect this, but we'll do whatever we can to ensure the transition goes smoothly." Charles didn't acknowledge the formality or offer the expected pleasantries. Instead, his gaze locked onto Clarkson, his eyes cold and unwavering. "I don't need smooth," Charles replied, his voice flat but loaded with authority. "What I need is control." There was an almost imperceptible pause as his words hung in the air. "I didn't buy this airline to sit in the background. I bought it because I was disrespected, and now it's time for all of you to understand who holds the power here." His words struck like a thunderclap in a quiet room. The room fell silent. Clarkson, now visibly tense, nodded in a way that Charles knew was out of obligation more than understanding. Charles could tell that Clarkson hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a business acquisition, it was personal. Charles had made his move, and no one was going to take that away from him. With a final glance at the room, he turned to leave, but before he exited, he left them with a chilling reminder. "I trust you'll all perform your duties until the end of the week. After that, we'll be discussing new leadership." As Charles walked out, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. The tension was palpable. Outside, reporters had already gathered in a frenzy, firing off questions as Charles made his way through the crowd. His expression remained composed, betraying none of the satisfaction bubbling beneath his surface. He was done with pleasantries. He had much bigger plans, and this was only the beginning of what he intended to build. Charles smiled as he drove away from the building. He thought of the flight attendant who had kicked him off that plane, the same woman who had unwittingly sparked this entire chain of events. She would never forget today, and neither would anyone else. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets buzzed with the shocking details of Charles's acquisition, and everywhere he went, people whispered about him. The media coverage was relentless, but Charles didn't care. He thrived in chaos. It was no longer about the acquisition. It was about asserting his control, about making a statement that no one would forget. His move had caught everyone off guard, and now they were all scrambling to catch up. Inside the airline's headquarters, the executives were in damage control mode. CEO David Clarkson and the board members, all blindsided by the aggressive takeover, were working overtime, trying to come to terms with their new reality. But Charles wasn't interested in their apologies or reassurances. He had already made it clear that he wasn't there to make friends. 3 days after the acquisition, Charles called a meeting with his new management team. The room was filled with some of the airline's top executives, most of whom were visibly uncomfortable with the sudden change in leadership. But Charles exuded confidence. He sat at the head of the table, a slight smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the anxious faces in front of him. "I'm sure some of you have questions," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "But before we get into that, let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to run this company the way it's been run for years. This airline is going to be different. It's going to be efficient. It's going to be profitable. And most importantly, it's going to respect people, from the ground crew to the passengers." The room fell into a heavy silence. No one dared to interrupt. The air was thick with tension as they waited for what he would say next. "I've heard a lot of complaints about the culture here," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "I've heard that employees are overworked and underappreciated. I've heard that customers are treated like they don't matter. That's going to change. And it's going to change right now." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. "We're not going to be the airline people dread flying with. We're going to be the airline people choose because they know we care about their experience. And if any of you think that's too much to ask, I suggest you start looking for another job. I don't tolerate mediocrity." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Charles could see the discomfort in their eyes, but he didn't care. This was his show now, and it was time to set the tone. He wasn't interested in playing the political games that had kept the airline stagnant for years. He was here to make things happen, and he was going to do it fast. As the meeting progressed, Charles outlined a series of sweeping reforms. He talked about streamlining operations, improving customer service, and cutting unnecessary costs. But the most important change was the restructuring of the management team. He wasn't afraid to make enemies. Those who had allowed the airline to stagnate, those who had let things slide for too long, would be gone. The culture of complacency was over. When the meeting finally ended, Charles stood up, signaling the close of the session. As the executives filed out, most of them walked with their heads down, clearly shaken by the upheaval he had instigated in just a few days. But Charles wasn't concerned with their discomfort. He had made his point. No one would challenge him. No one would treat him like a nobody. But there was still one unresolved matter. The flight attendant, Jenna, the woman who had started this entire saga. Charles had thought about her every day since the incident. At first, it had been a fleeting annoyance, something he could brush off. But now, after everything he had accomplished, he realized that Jenna was more than just an annoyance. She was a symbol of how people had underestimated him. She had no idea who she was dealing with. But Charles wasn't the type of man who would let that slide. He wasn't sure yet what he would do about Jenna, but one thing was certain: she would not get off easy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about sending a message. In Charles's world, no one got to disrespect him and walk away without consequences. As the days passed, Charles's grip on the airline tightened. The sweeping changes he had put in place began to take effect. The corporate atmosphere was shifting from complacency to high-stakes efficiency. Some employees were skeptical, unsure of how the new leadership would affect their daily routines. But many others welcomed the change. They could feel the difference. Things were moving faster. Decisions were being made with authority, and there was a clear sense that the company was no longer adrift. Charles was relentless. He held weekly meetings with department heads, demanding progress reports and offering little patience for delays. Employees who didn't pull their weight were quickly shown the door. He had no tolerance for mediocrity, and the results began to show immediately. Stock prices soared. Customer satisfaction improved. Even the staff in the terminals seemed more motivated. But no matter how much progress he made, one thing still weighed heavily on his mind. Jenna, the flight attendant who had sparked this entire saga. She hadn't forgotten him, but it was clear now that he was the one who had the upper hand. To her, he had been just another passenger. But to him, that moment had been a direct insult. An insult he had turned into an empire. He had been given a platform to reshape everything, and he intended to use it. Time, he knew, was his greatest ally, and when the right moment came, Charles would ensure that Jenna understood exactly how much she had altered the course of her own life with one rash decision. The stage was set. Charles Blackwood wasn't just building an airline, he was forging a legacy, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it, the consequences of underestimating him. But despite her public downfall, Charles couldn't completely shake the feeling that Jenna's presence still loomed over him. It wasn't just about punishing her. It was about sending a message to the entire company and industry. Yet there was still that piece of unfinished business, a nagging thought that even in her absence, Jenna's defiance had been a spark that fueled his relentless pursuit of power. In the weeks following her dismissal, while the company's transformation continued at full force, Charles kept his eye on how the media and employees spoke about her. Some saw her as a martyr, others as a cautionary tale. But to Charles, it didn't matter how they viewed her, it mattered how they viewed him. He had made an example of her, but now he was focused on the next steps of his plan. With the company's new direction well on its way, Charles felt secure, knowing that the message he had sent was being absorbed. But in the back of his mind, Jenna was always there as a reminder of his willingness to act swiftly and without mercy. Perhaps one day she would become more than a fleeting memory, but for now her story served as a lesson to anyone who might think they could cross him. The company had changed, the culture had shifted, and Charles Blackwood had emerged not only as the leader of an airline, but as a symbol of the lengths one could go to reshape an empire. As for Jenna, her fate had been sealed in public, but Charles knew that it wasn't just her downfall that mattered. It was the fear that everyone else would feel, knowing that defiance had its consequences, and with that, Charles's reign was fully established. Those who remained in his company knew one thing above all else. To cross him was to risk everything. It sounds like you're sharing the story of Charles Blackwood, a ruthless, power-hungry businessman whose drive for control leads him to destroy the career of an employee, Jenna Richards, who dared to defy him. Over time, Charles achieves success, but ultimately, he begins to question the meaning of his victories and the cost of his ambitions. The story is a journey from domination to introspection and personal growth, where Charles transforms from a man driven by revenge and control into someone seeking more meaningful goals, growth with purpose, compassion, and the well-being of others. This narrative explores themes of power, redemption, and the cost of unchecked ambition. Charles's initial desire to crush Jenna and assert his dominance in the business world leaves him feeling empty and questioning the true meaning of success. By the end of the story, he is seeking balance and a new purpose, one focused on integrity, respect, and collaboration, both in his business and personal life. It's a compelling tale about transformation, with the core lesson being that true success lies not in dominating others, but in creating something that lasts and positively impacts those around you.